Welcome to HealthCast. I'm your host, Adam Patterson. We are joined today by Dr. Mary Jo Pugh, a research career scientist who works within the Department of Veterans Affairs Informatics, Decision Enhancement, and Analytics Sciences Center of Innovation. Dr. Pugh has overseen substantial work into understanding both the origins and pathology of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, and has been instrumental in applying artificial intelligence towards advancing the treatment of various forms of neurological damage. We talked with Dr. Pugh about how VA is using newfound data processing to elucidate a complex and challenging condition, and how these initiatives are improving the care delivered to veterans nationwide. Dr. Pugh, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. It really is. And I want to start and open with a question about yourself. And just as some background for our audience, can you tell us a bit about your career and your research interests and what brought you to your current role at VA?
That's an interesting question. So I actually started my career as an Air Force nurse. I was hit by a car when I was training for a triathlon in 1985, and I was thankful that I had a helmet on, which is not something that was very common back in the mid 80s. And I had a brain injury. And I'm thankful that I had my helmet on, or I might have been dead, but that's partly why I'm here today. After I got medically retired from the Air Force, I went on to graduate school. I was a spouse of a military member as well. And so we traveled around, and I eventually got my PhD at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., focusing on developmental psychology, which in general uses longitudinal methodologies. And so what I did after we moved to Boston, my husband's last Air Force move, I started working at the VA in Bedford, Massachusetts, as a data analyst, and I integrated my background as a nurse and my longitudinal methodology to then start a postdoctoral fellowship. And I studied complex comorbidities in older veterans. And then as the wars began, because this was before the wars began, I was interested in using those methods to understand longitudinal outcomes of military exposures. And TBI was one of the big early exposures that became quite apparent. And so that's how I came to do what I'm doing today.
Yeah, it sounds like a really fortuitous convergence because, again, like TBI is an immensely complex condition with a large range of, as you said, comorbidities, long-term complications, and sort of using that background in data analytics to help elucidate those, it sounds like was really, really conducive. And to kind of get down to the subject at hand, again, before we talk about it in more detail, what are some of the distinguishing features of TBI and what among its range of complex symptoms, both physical and psychological, are common after effects of that kind of cranial injury?
So it depends on the severity of the injury, right? So the majority of TBIs that occur in the VA are mild traumatic brain injuries. And so some people call those concussion. And those typically in over 85%, probably some would say over 90%, people recover with no real evidence of an impact. What we do know in the veteran population, where a lot of these mild TBIs occur in a setting where it's potentially combat or in an accident, we see also comorbid post-traumatic stress disorder, some depression, and a lot of pain. And so we have those, we call that the polytrauma phenotype or polytrauma clinical triad. So that's what you see a lot of, but we're also finding that down the road, we're finding issues even related to cardiovascular disease are more common, even in these veterans with mild traumatic brain injuries. There are some concerns about memory problems and ultimately dementia. That's most common in people who have a more severe injury where, say, there's bleeding in the brain or a penetration of the brain by something externally. So. But I think cognitive issues, kind of emerging chronic disease, and just mental health and pain are the biggest things that we see.
Yeah, you'd mentioned, again, it sounds like, again, a lot of comorbidities, a lot of overlap. Again, it sounds like the work on mental health and the relationship between combat stress, or what was previously referred to as shell shock, PTSD is really essential for both distinguishing those two, but also understanding the interplay. And you'd mentioned that again, you had started a lot of your research work and a lot of your data intensive research prior to I think the post 9/11 wars. And I kind of want to harken back to that a little bit. And I'm wondering, why did the incidence of TBI among veterans increase during post 9/11 deployments? And what drove VA to begin dedicating these kind of special efforts to TBI research?
I think there's some discussion or disagreements that TBI is actually increased in post 9/11 deployments. I think there were a lot of, like, the roadside bombs, the IEDs, the rocket propelled grenades, a lot of explosions. Those same kinds of explosions occurred in other wars, maybe not quite as commonly with the roadside devices, that kind of thing. But I believe that what happened though is that we had great in theater care and people survived more frequently than they had previously. So some of the more severely injured veterans in other wars wouldn't have survived. It became apparent as veterans came back, as service members were coming back, and they were in Walter Reed, that there were that there were impacts that affected the brain, and PTSD also affects the brain. All of these are brain health issues, but responses from just people's, I think the service members' complaints of memory issues and just I and actually I think one thing that I became apparent was family members said he or she is just not the same person. That actually was something that drove a lot of this. Caregivers and family members actually had a pretty nice impact on how this became more apparent and how the federal government began to look at it and say, "Oh my God, you're right. This is a problem."
Yeah, that's really heartening and really interesting. And I really like your point too about the fact that, in theater care is more sophisticated than it's ever been, which meant that, survival rates were higher. And so, it's not necessarily like, for example, IEDs, we're creating a novel rate of TBIs because, explosions have been, a weapon of war for longer than anyone of us would like. But, it is clear that was clearly a correlation there too. That's really, again, really interesting. And it sounds like in tandem with a lot of these increasingly sophisticated, TBI research programs and focuses on advancing treatment methodology and comorbidity analysis, VA has also clearly been investing in, modernizing its IT infrastructure and in pooling its data resources, both within VA but also from certain partners as well. And I'm wondering, how have these investments and what about VA's data research usage in particular has been conducive to this increasingly sophisticated kind of TBI research?
Oh, I think VA's infrastructure has been really helpful. Back in I think the early teens, I started working because I was in San Antonio. I worked with the Joint Trauma System. I was able to drive over after I completed all the paperwork and pick up a disc that was encrypted that had the joint, the DoD trauma registry data for service members who had injuries. But now we can do all that electronically, and we can actually connect the DoD and VA data securely behind the VA firewall, so that it preserves people's privacy and security. But we can link and have that longitudinal record, and that is on a platform called Da Vinci, and it's a platform that VA and DoD have invested in, that allows researchers to connect DoD and VA data securely and look at the longitudinal record, including the health status prior to injury, which a lot of prior work was not able to do that. And if we look at just VA data, we don't know what the person's health status was before the injury. And so we're limited in what we can say about the trajectory of that person's health.
Yeah, and it really sounds like that sort of data connectivity between DoD records and again the both the quality of care, but also the quality of data being derived from sort of battlefield triage and the like, and bringing that together with VA records was really important for that kind of long term analysis that it sounds like you're really overseeing and VA is focusing on in terms of kind of guiding the care of veterans who've suffered TBI and trauma and are really trying to recover from that over the course of their lives. And to drill a bit more into like the really cutting edge stuff you're doing, clearly you're looking a lot into the usage of AI and machine learning and other capacities that take these large and potentially disparate data sets to really analyze them against each other to find, correlations. You mentioned the interesting fact that like TBI is also often related to cardiovascular strain, which you wouldn't immediately intuit. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a bit about how AI and machine learning capacities are useful for a better understanding TBI's outcomes and its associated long-term symptoms?
So I think AI methods are going to be essential to really understand the interconnections of diseases. So you have the disease networks, and you can see that longitudinally with these longitudinal data. But and you can do a logistic regression with typical methods, but you don't see all of the interconnections. And I'm not 100% positive, but I believe very strongly we're going to see some interesting connections that we didn't realize before. But we can also connect things, not just like diagnosis codes, which is what we've done in the past, and we can do that. But we can connect lab results, we can connect radiology results, and in situations like the long-term impact of military relevant brain injury consortium, where we have a prospective study that goes beyond the health system records, but incorporates the health system records. We have biomarkers in blood that are specific to TBI that we can't necessarily get otherwise. We have neuroimaging results that use, I don't even know how many areas of interest, regions of interest that are incorporated into analyses. It depends on what the question is. But we have neuroimaging results, we have biomarker results, we have neuropsychology test results, we have longitudinal health system results and history. And so trying to incorporate all of that complex data is not possible with traditional biostatistical methods. And so when we have new approaches that allow us to incorporate all of the networks using AI methods, I believe we're going to find some very interesting results. And that's where we're going to see breakthroughs in treatment and prevention efforts.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like it already started to have seen those things. Again, you'd mentioned things ranging from sort of like the psychological data to like the raw health information, really layering these kinds of seemingly disparate data sets that obviously have potential correlation. Sounds like it's been a really driving force. And I want to touch a bit on, which organizations you're partnering with in terms of like either developing the expertise and the baseline, I guess you could say, algorithms or methods of analyzing data, as well as drawing the data itself, because you mentioned the obvious partnership with DoD in drawing those kind of service related information and data sources. But what other organizations has VA partnered with in creating the data models that are really necessary to better understand TBI?
Well, I think that what we have been doing, and it's through kind of the research consortia that this has been happening for, that's focused on TBI. It's just really collaboration with TBI experts across the world. Actually, we're working with the Brits, we're working with people across the United States, and also we were talking recently with Israeli military folks. So a lot of it is military related collaborations. And the VA does now have this NAII, National AI Institute, the National AI Institute, which is something that I was not aware of previously before the Brain Summit. But this, I believe the NAII has great potential to help us make the next steps, because without that kind of knowledge and baseline, just big AI, kind of like Google AI is what they're going to bring us, the capacity to do that kind of work. Without that, and without the building resources that are growing, because the AI structure, doing the IT structures have been pretty unsophisticated to date. They've been great, but they have not allowed the type of computing that's necessary. But with the NAII and the resources that are coming with that, we're going to actually have the computing capacity to do what we've been wanting to do for some time.
Yeah, that all sounds really promising, and it sounds like you're reaching a moment of real consolidation, where a lot of these parties that are invested around a pretty similar, if not singular, research goal are really pooling together their resources and allowing, again, the powering and fueling with, again, data and information sources, the kind of models you need to really kind of suss out these connections and trace the long-term impacts of TBI. And I want to get down to a particularly promising study that I think you've been associated with. And I'm wondering, can you explain a bit about the Limbic phenotype study and how its findings have been useful for driving this kind of TBI research forward?
Yeah, the Limbic phenotype study is a study that I started when it was still Chronic Effects of Neurotrauma Consortium. And basically we have a cohort of 2.5 million service members and veterans that we've been following up to 20 years, which is an amazing resource. And what we've been able to do with those data is to identify trajectories of health. And we found some very interesting. So I described that the polytrauma phenotype earlier, which is really a combination of TBI related conditions, mental health conditions, and pain. And we've actually found with that study that we see trajectories that are relatively stable in that phenotype, ones that start off pretty healthy but then decline. And then there's another phenotype that starts off with this polytrauma phenotype but actually seems to get better. And right now what we're doing is we're looking at the DoD data in this longitudinal trajectory to try to understand what kind of things we see in DoD that predict this trajectory of improvement and also the trajectory of decline. Because if we can identify people early who may have a decline or an improvement, the decline we can try to focus on prevention efforts to prevent the decline. And for the improvement efforts, if we can understand what is it about those people that lead to improvements? Is it a resilience factor? Is it different kinds of healthcare received? That kind of thing. We can improve outcomes long-term for our service members and veterans.
Yeah, and that sounds really promising because, again, it sounds like the Limbic phenotype study really centers on looking at the best outcomes possible and really tracing back, almost kind of doing a bit of retrospective analysis on how those were achieved. That's really promising and sounds really smart. And I want to wrap up with a final question that's a bit more hypothetical. But again, we've talked a lot about data inputs and a lot about what has really helped kind of provide this new level of sophistication to TBI research and outcome analysis. And going forwards, ideally, what other data inputs would be most useful for integrating within VA's broader TBI research models?
From a population-based perspective?
Absolutely.
Okay, so from a population-based perspective, I think it would, my ideal situation would be a situation where you could incorporate non-VA care and not just non-VA care that VA pays for, but private care. That gives you a better perspective on everything that's happening with the health, but also social determinants of health issues. So what we see in the healthcare data are just health factors, but we know that over 50% of health outcomes are socially determined. So social determinants of health have an enormous impact on health outcomes. And if we could incorporate that into the health factors and the health status and even, in health measures, I think we could have a better idea of what kind of factors are associated with improvements and decline.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like it would be especially useful, really broadening your database. You mentioned just bringing in data from private practice as well. And again, before we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about, the TBI research you've been looking over, or maybe where things might be going with TBI research at VA going forward?
From the perspective of my study, I believe that we have great promise in knowing that TBI isn't just necessarily you don't necessarily have a horrible outcome from TBI, right? And I think that that's something that isn't always, I think when you look at the news and when we look at what is published in the common press, we often see things that are, for veterans, are not positive. But I think there's a lot positive. We just need to look for that in the data too. So we need to look at not just what's going to be bad or what are negative outcomes, but what are positive outcomes. And I believe that the ability to incorporate new data pieces will help us do that too. So we can look at what kind of things we can do to improve health and what kind of things we can glean from people who are successful and have better outcomes that can help people long term. That's not very clear.
But it does make sense, though. That's again, totally fine. Again, Dr. Pugh, I just want to thank you so much for coming onto the program and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
HealthCast, along with GovCast and Cybercast, is a production of GovCIO Media and Research. For more podcasts and to check out the other shows, head to govciomedia.com. Watch out for new episodes released every Tuesday and Wednesday across our shows. You can follow all of them in your favorite podcast platform, and if you like what you heard, make sure to let us know by leaving a review. And if you have any topics you think we should look into, contact us at newsletter@gcio.com.